In this presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the language you should use when addressing and refuting counterarguments, or in the case of your problem solution paper, addressing and refuting counter solutions, which is another form of counterargument. It's very important when you raise a counterargument that it's clear from your language that you are bringing up a counterargument, so it doesn't seem to readers that you just suddenly changed your mind and are arguing for the other side. And you use certain transitional words, phrases, etc., to signal to your reader that you're raising a counterargument, and then signal again when you're then refuting or shutting down that counterargument. So when you raise the counterargument, we refer to this as the turn against. And the language that you use, again, makes it clear that you're bringing up someone else's point of view that contradicts your point of view for the purposes of eventually refuting it. So some of that language can be, for example, some say, or critics object, or others contend. These are all ways of showing your reader, now I'm bringing up someone else's point of view. Opponents argue, proponents insist, some claim. Again, all of this language is a signal to your readers. Then when it's time to refute the counterargument, it's what we call as the turn back, where you're now bringing your paper back to your point of view and showing why that counterargument isn't a good enough reason not to agree with you. And now our language is going to be signaling that we're moving against the counterargument and back to supporting our argument on the other side. So then it'll be, but, in fact, whatever, or yet, etc., or however, this, fails to consider X. Nevertheless, the issue remains, contentious or whatever, still it's essential that we, do whatever. So let's look at an example of this language in action. Let's say I was writing my paper arguing that the words "under God" should be removed from the Pledge of Allegiance. I would bring up a counter argument that 60% of Americans object to changing the pledge, which would indicate that perhaps the pledge shouldn't be changed because most Americans don't want it to change. So according to a recent poll, 60% of Americans object to changing the Pledge of Allegiance because it goes against the patriotic tradition established by our forefathers. That's the turn against. I'm bringing up the counter argument. Now I'm going to turn back to my argument and signal that I'm going to now refute that counter argument. However, the words "under God" were added to the pledge in 1954 during the Second Red Scare. And then I'll kind of hammer my point home as to why that's not a good argument against my point of view and say, thus, removing this phrase from the pledge would actually return it to the original version. So basically, while there are many good reasons to be against changing the Pledge of Allegiance by removing the words "under God," it going against the patriotic tradition established by our forefathers is not a particularly good reason. And here I can just kind of, shut down that kind of argument by providing evidence that, the original pledge did not contain these words, and therefore removing them as actually more faithful to our forefathers' vision or whatever. Sometimes you can't easily shut down a counterargument by just proving that it's wrong, and then you need to use more conciliatory language, where maybe you have to basically admit that the counterargument makes a good point, but then still indicate why it doesn't make a good enough point to invalidate your argument or your proposal. So then you use language like "of course," "of course it's true," or "admittedly it's true," or "it might seem that this is a case for not changing the Pledge of Allegiance." But what about "it's true that," etc. So we're basically now saying, here's the counter argument, and it makes a good point, but we're still going to refute it. So, for example, if I say, let's say I'm writing in favor of the Tennessee Promise Scholarship, which is a scholarship that allows any, student in Tennessee to attend community college for free. So again, I'm going to bring up the counter argument by signaling to my readers that I'm now addressing an opponent's point of view. Opponents of the Tennessee Promise Scholarship argue that as a last dollar scholarship, it will have little impact on the ability of low-income families to send students to college, since those students' tuition would likely be covered by a federal Pell Grant anyway. That is 100% true. That is a good point. So now I have to concede that kind of territory that, yeah, it's a good point. It's not a bad argument, but then still talk about why my point of view is still the more valid point of view. So it is true that those most likely to benefit from Tennessee Promise are middle and high income students who don't qualify for the Hope Scholarship and or federal grants. So I'm conceding, good point. Then I'm still turning back. But why is that a bad thing? These are the same students most likely to be saddled with crippling student loan debt, an increasing burden not just on individuals, but on the nation's economy. So again, I'm bringing it up with the turn against language, and then I'm shutting it down, or at least reasserting my point of view with the turn back language. So let's look at another example. This example is a little bit dated because now we know that, recently the Redskins did in fact change their name, but you'll get the idea. My position is because Redskins is a racial slur, the Washington Redskins should be required by the NFL to change their name. So one counter argument could be that the team was actually named the Redskins to honor Native American football player and coach William Lone Star Dietz. Therefore it shouldn't be considered offensive to Native Americans because it was chosen to honor a Native American. I can counter this counter argument with my research. And my research tells me that George Preston Marshall, who originated the Redskins name, was on record as a racist and a segregationist. And furthermore, many people believe that Lone Star Dietz was not actually Native American. He just kind of played one or pretended to be one. So sometimes you can use research to refute a counter argument. Another counter argument that I would need to deal with would be that Dan Snyder, the Redskins owner, says 70 different high schools in 25 states are known as the Redskins, and there are almost as many schools using the name Redskins as Cowboys. So again, I need to counter this argument. One way I can do that is by pointing out that it's not a very logical argument. Just because 70 different high schools in 25 states use the name Redskins doesn't make the name okay. In fact, I could even turn that to my advantage and say the fact that so many different schools full of impressionable young people are using this name makes it even more imperative that the NFL set a good example and change the name as a kind of teachable moment. So sometimes you can refute counter arguments with your research. Sometimes you can refute counter arguments with better logic. The important thing is that you're bringing it up and then you're shutting it down, and you're using signal phrases to readers so that they can follow you easily and don't get confused as to, why you're suddenly bringing up something that doesn't agree with your argument. Rather, they understand that you're bringing it up because a good argument is only as good as its defense. You not only need to support your point of view, but you also have to defend it. And if you don't bring it up, then your readers might think it and then end up ultimately not agreeing with you. I like to think of this as yeah, but moments where if a reader is reading my paper and they read one of my points and they say, yeah, but what about if they're thinking it at that point in the paper, I should probably bring it up and then shut it down before I move on. So think about these things as you are working on your problem solution papers. There may be counter arguments to address within your definition of the problem itself. And there should certainly be counter arguments in the form of counter solutions in terms of other solutions that people propose, and then why your solution or solutions are better.